you are one of the co-hosts of
Yes.
Mommying Well Muslim. And I want to talk about that. First of all, I want to ask you about like why you wanted to start this. But you know, also coming from the point of view that, a lot of non-Muslim Americans have, probably including myself, have a lot of misconceptions about Muslim Americans, and also our ideas are very much colored by the media.
Yes.
My sister-in-law, but I've had some experiences that have sort of opened my perception just a little bit, knowing that like in the media, this perception is that like every Muslim is like really devout and on the like conservative end. And but yeah, I have a sister-in-law who's she's simply culturally Muslim because her father, she's Senegalese. She grew up in Italy, but she's Senegalese. Her family's Senegalese. And so they, and so they're, she just like, the only reason because I tried to give her some bacon and she was like, no, thanks. But
And you're like,
that
why? Don't you want to eat some pork
I
today?
was super confused. Like, why would you
Like, why
not
are you
eat
saying
bacon?
no? Bacon is the best.
I know that was the only sign I ever had. I was like, oh, I didn't even realize. So like there's just like at least my understanding is,
Mhm.
just like any other religion, there's a whole
Yes.
gamut from like culturally non-practicing to like really intense. There's that whole spectrum there. So
100%.
okay, good. Just wanted to get that out there because I think that there's like a weird perception out there. So why did you start mommying while Muslim?
Well, we talk about it a lot on the podcast because it really was something. I grew up biracial. My mom was a convert. She is of Irish descent. My dad is Pakistani. In like the late 70s, early 80s, as I'm going to be dating myself and telling people how old I am, over 40 and feeling fabulous. But it was just one of those things where, I pass like, and that's a term that a lot of D&I people use, and
Wait, D and I.
diversity and inclusion.
Okay.
It's so when you can pass for the majority population within the country. So for me, until somebody hears my name, they're not quite sure what I am, who I am, so they kind of just loop me into your quote unquote normal. And one day we were traveling home from Chicago, which is where my family's from. I was traveling with my 4 kids. My oldest at the time was 14. 14, at that stage where he kind of looks like a man, not like a man, that weird gangly teenage phase. And I'm always the caboose. I'm sure you probably have a similar system. So I'm in the caboose. I'm with my younger one who was in the stroller at the time. And I can't believe he was in the stroller because he looks such a big boy now. And all of a sudden I was like, what is taking so long? And the security guy was kind of giving my son a hard time. So I kind of had my daughter watch the younger two, and I walked up and I'm like, is everything okay? They're like, he doesn't have an ID. You guys can't get past. And I'm like, he's 14. He doesn't need an ID. Like, there's no way he's 14. And our last name is Hasan, which is a very
Mm.
obviously Muslim last name. And after 45 minutes of interrogation, separating my kids and essentially asking them, like, how old is your brother? All these questions, because of course I'm not traveling with ID for him. I had my ID, and that's pretty much about it. And we sat down, we finally got to the gate barely. And my oldest was kind of like, what was that about? And then I realized at that time, he was now being viewed as a Muslim man in
Mm.
America versus a Muslim boy. And his experiences are going to be different than mine as a mom. And I didn't know how to support him because these types of microaggressions hadn't necessarily happened to me at that point, right? In
Mhm.
that capacity where I'm like, I can't argue, you feel helpless because I'm like, are they going to take him somewhere? Like, I'm going to be by myself. What rights do I have? I had a childhood friend, her name is Dr. Usma Jaffrey, and I called her up and I'm like, is there a place where I can kind of like go and find answers? Because he's really concerned about this happening and I don't know how to help him. And she was like, she literally said to me, why are you not traveling with your passports? You need to be traveling with your passports, because she is a very identifiably Muslim
Mm.
woman, and her family is as well. And she has always had that experience of being stopped. And so in my quest to essentially find the answers for myself, I recognize that we as American Muslim women and mothers in this country, meaning our parents might have come from another country, but we were born and raised here, and our kids literally have zero relation to any other country but America. We're this really unique generation in trying to raise native born Muslims that are 100% American, but they're still being almost like, what's the word? I can't explain. Not that they're being blamed, but they're definitely being made to answer about an event, September 11th, that happened before they were even born. And in trying to find the answers for myself, I realized there wasn't any. So we decided to start one. And funnily enough, we decided that's how Momming While Muslim podcast was born. And a majority of our listeners were actually non-Muslim, which I thought was such a happy accident, because I believe that because we feel very differently, Uzma and myself, and we bring a lot of American Muslim moms on the show that think very differently than we do. We're providing an insight into what is actually American Muslims. And like you said in the beginning, we're different shapes, sizes, cultures, colors, ethnicities, and we are so diverse. We're probably one of the most ethnically diverse religions if we actually do the research on it. And a lot of people don't know that because the media focuses on one demographic, which tends to be the Gulf Arabs, which we're not even Arab, right? So it's one of those things where, you're kind of put into this box and you don't belong there. And our kids are like, I don't even want to be near the box. So how to support them while keeping their identity is something that we feel very strongly about at Momming While Muslim.
Yeah, that's interesting because as a minority religion, there's all these different people that that are like you said, all the different shapes and sizes and colors and yet it's not visible, right? The only visible piece that non-Muslims see is like a woman in a hijab or a scarf or whatever,
or she's being mistreated by her husband and she's quiet, but the majority of the women that I know are extremely loud. They're in charge of their households and it's a very different situation. So we kind of wanted to break down the barriers. We've kind of given this accidental mic to break down some of these stereotypical barriers, and we're just kind of running with it. We're like, we don't represent all American Muslims, but if you need somebody, we will get it for you.
Do you see that in the United States, as the generations are progressing, that things are changing in Islamic culture in the United States? I'm just wondering about that because I've been doing some work for a conference that a parenting unconference that's going to be happening in Abu Dhabi. And
that'd be great.
There are some culturally sensitive topics that we can't address. And we're kind of I'm in this content group and I'm going to be a speaker there, but I'm also we're also, we're hoping to maybe address these maybe in future years, right? To kind of warm up the audience. Yes. But
you don't want to shock people on your first hands.
No. Exactly. So are you because culture in, at least in the United States, culture is progressing. There's people fighting for trans rights and queer rights and all of these different things. And we're moving away from conservative, whatever religion they are, sort of places. And are you seeing that the Islamic culture, at least around you guys and your, contemporaries, is also changing?
So, the funny thing is, when you talk about the conservative Muslims, right? But when you actually go to the conservative principles of Islam, and you go back to the time when it was starting to be developed, the things that make us Muslim today were so, out of the ordinary for the time and the place, meaning
it was really progressive at the time.
It was extremely progressive.
I didn't know anything about it, but and I'm not Christian. I was raised without a religion. So I took a world religions class.
Yes.
And one of the first things he started talking about was Abraham. And I had to be like, excuse me, who's Abraham? I was the only person.
You're what? What's going on?
And I just started, but the whole idea that like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all connected by this
Yes.
figure. And then, it gets a little like there are these, Jesus was super progressive and is a
Yes.
figure in Islam. And
Yes.
then, Islam was super progressive for the time, which is
Yes.
something also I learned on your
Yes.
podcast because I listened
Exactly.
to the best of episode and it talked
Yes.
about how Allah was like pro like women's pleasure. I was
Oh
like, how
yeah.
is this like fabulous? I
Those are
mean,
our favorite episodes. They're like,
that was
and that's kind of what happens. Like the patriarchal system that came onto Islam
Mhm.
took a lot of that off and put this culture on top of the religion. And what I'm finding is because we're so diverse culturally, right here in the quote unquote salad melting pot, whatever the turn of phrase is that we're using right now in America, we can take the culture of quote unquote back home out and focus
Mm.
on what the religion ultimately stands for and what it needs to be. So I would argue that our kids are moving towards that progressive that progressive Islam that is what it was supposed to be if you took the culture out of it, because we don't have a joint culture, right? Whether it's
Mhm.
Arab or whatever. These kids have taken that off and they're like, okay, we're American and we're American Muslim. Like my daughter is literally, she woke up on her own. I couldn't fast today. It's Ramadan. So
Oh.
she woke up on her own this morning and made her breakfast. She did all that on her own. I don't say you have to fast or have to, but she understands the principle. She wants to do it. She feels empowered and she feels good when she does it. These kids are making those choices on their own because they're reading about the why and not being told you have to. So I would
Mm.
argue that these kids are actually really looking at Islam the way that it's supposed to be portrayed. What is the spiritual aspect? Like I talk about this all the time on the podcast. We pray 5 times a day, right? A lot of people are like, what the heck are you doing? You're so super conservative. And I tell people, I'm like, do you think God needs us to pray to him, regardless of what God you believe in? He does not, but he recognizes the weakness in us as humans to take those mindfulness breaks throughout the day
Mhm.
that has been scientifically proven to increase productivity, help with your brain synapses, and to be able to like rest and recharge throughout the day. I view prayer as that.
Mhm.
My opportunity to rest and recharge. It's a great, and that's how I teach my children.
Mm.
So, do I think I'm going to hell if I forget a prayer? No, but I know God knows I need to take a break and to pray. So,
Mm.
I feel like these kids are getting that versus getting the, if you like how I was raised, like if you don't pray, blah, 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 but then your parents aren't telling you what was the meaning of prayer. What is that spiritual aspect behind it? Why do we fast? Is it just because we don't want to eat and drink during the day? No, what are we trying to feel? What are we trying to embrace? Those are the things that these kids are actually moving towards that I think is an amazing thing. Having frank conversations about sex and sexuality and dating and these types of things, which I have a feeling those are the types of topics you cannot talk about in Abu Dhabi, but being open and receptive to your children, recognizing that they're sexual beings and giving them the power to be able to want to explore that. That is a God-given right to us as Muslims that we don't talk about
Mm.
enough. But so my kids are very unfortunately probably way too open with me about these types of things, but I feel like I'd
You're
rather
like,
them
enough.
ask me. Yeah, I'm like, I don't need to know. Here you go. But the reality is you want to create that open space of dialogue because guess what? Where else are they going to get that information from other than from you? And I would much rather them get it from trust, or if it's not for me, a trusted source. And that's what we at Momming While Muslim have done is curated an amazing group of women that are experts in their field. And I feel like we're breaking those stereotypes that we've been put into.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I think that what I'm hearing you say is like it's like you're taking these pieces that feed you, you're taking these essentials, you're taking the why, and you're also kind of growing with your kids and learning and and et cetera.
Yes.
It's not a rigid practice. And that whole idea of like the idea of it being modeled, being,
Yes.
like understanding the why, like practices being modeled, practicing, understanding the why and not forcing. It's
Yeah.
fascinating because we recently had Micheline Duclef on, who wrote Hunt, Gather, Parent, and she went and talked to all these different indigenous cultures all around the world. And some cultures, like particularly Mayan cultures, have like extremely helpful kids. And that was part of the thing. It was like the kids were never forced. It was modeled. They were invited. They were told, why, but it was never forced. And that's this beautiful key to honoring our children's autonomy. And then, and that when we honor their autonomy, then they can choose to be, to embrace their culture and the things that their parents are presenting. It's not like a force they have to push away from.
Exactly. And you're practicing something knowing the why. How amazing is that? It's not, I'm just going through these rituals for the sake of going through these rituals because this is what people do. But okay, let's go and explore what is the reason. So like even during this month of Ramadan, the whole point is to kind of read the Quran, which is our holy book. And a lot of these people read it in the native Arabic. My kids do know Arabic, but it's obviously not their native language. So that's the one thing I do. I make them read it in English because I'm like, you have to know what you're reading. And if you have something that you don't understand and you question it because it doesn't make any sense, let's go work together to figure out why that came and why that happened. Because how the Quran was revealed was it would different sections would come out at different times, right? And what was happening was a certain period of history. So I'm like, don't just take it for very fact. Go and read when it was revealed, why it was revealed, what was going on historically. And then you can go back and be like, oh, that's why. So if you take anything, one snippet, one line out of context, anything without knowing the full story around it, it can be a negative or it can be positive and not necessarily be a positive thing. So I really, and I feel like that is the new movement of parents here in America as American Muslims, is to really force our kids to be like, okay, we want you to question. We want you to be like, okay, why is this happening? What, like I say, I was born Muslim, but I've, as an adult, chosen to be Muslim. I have my master's in divinity. I've read all the religions. I love it. We all have the same core, but ultimately for me, the path of getting to God is this path. But I feel like all the paths to get you to a higher spiritual being, in essence, that's the path you're supposed to be on. This is the path that I've chosen. So I make my kids question. And if you're questioning your faith, I don't want you to follow something blindly. I want you to go in and research it and talk to me about it.
Yes, that's beautiful. I love that. The whole idea of encouraging kids to question. Yes, yes, yes. Let's do that. Let's have them have more awareness.
Yes.
Yes. So what are some of the biggest challenges that Muslim families are facing in the United States that maybe non-Muslims are not going to be aware of?
Okay. So, and I'm going to try not to cry. So my son, I mentioned a little bit ahead of time that my son is going to college. He was pretty good about like, I want to do my own essays, blah, blah, blah. One day I happened to go, one of his essays was on the printer. I didn't think about it. I picked it up and I was reading it. And the first line was, I grew up in the shadow of the fallen towers. And as I read that, I was like, what is because he's captain of the basketball team. He's like one of those, he's literally that kid. Like if you watch, High School Musical, the teachers are high-fiving him in the hallways and I'm like, oh, what? This is the experience that you had? And I'm reading it like these kids are dealing with things that I thought we were protecting them from, but they're dealing with them. And it doesn't matter how much they were removed. It doesn't matter the steps that we, as American born Muslim, the original generation, past the 1960s, the immigration acts and all that happened after the civil rights movement. Our parents were that first generation that immigrated here. They're not American enough still.
Hmm.
And they're still having to identify, especially if my son is more of an olive tone complexion, he's a little bit darker. So he's still, obviously our last name is a very Muslim last name. Everybody knows it from seeing it. I, as a mom, didn't realize that. Even though you hear, microaggressions, people are like, somebody would say, "Oh, you speak English so well." Yeah, I was born and raised here. Of course, I speak English well. I majored in journalism. I'm not quite sure what to tell you. I'm sorry you're surprised. Or when they're like, "Oh, which kids are yours?" I'm like, "You see the only two dark-haired kids over there? Those are mine." Little things like that you can kind of like chalk off and put under the. But I didn't realize that my kids were experiencing that pretty firsthand, and I did a poor job in, I think, giving them the tools that they needed to kind of work through that. Obviously, they've done it on their own. So I feel very proud of them for that. But in reading that essay, which really happened very recently, was the first tangible sign that I saw that they're experiencing a different America than their peers are.
Hmm. And so are they, obviously there's challenges in the airport? Are they getting bullied at school? Like our parents, like, I imagine I would feel like if I was in that situation, I'd be like, "Oh, I want to homeschool my kids." Like, I imagine a bunch of parents might choose that. Like, is that happening?
So I do think that happens to a lot of kids. So I don't want to misrepresent that. It has not happened to my kids.
Okay.
And I do feel like athletics for them has helped them because it kind of put them in, I know this sounds terrible, but it puts them in a different category. But it does put them in a category to help other Muslim kids, which they do. Because their thing is, you might feel like you can't speak out, but I can, because I have quote unquote street cred and I will do that for you. But that it does happen to a lot of children. And just in little things like this. So I'm on the interfaith committee here in the state of Virginia, and somebody reached out to me yesterday, which I hadn't been aware. They're like, "Do you know one of these AP tests is on Eid?" I thought we fixed all. Eid is our religious holiday. It's like it's the end of Ramadan, one of our religious, and there's no makeup dates for it. So he would have to miss. And I said, "No, that can't be possible." Then I'm going back and I'm like, "Oh my God, sure enough, that is the case." So it's things like that we have to deal with. Now I had to go and connect her to the head of the Voice to be like, "Okay, now we have to go to the high school." Look, we just have to do these extra steps versus spring break is during Easter. You're going to get Easter taking, but now I have to go and reschedule a test that I need for college because it's on my religious. So I'm either choosing to celebrate with my family or I'm taking this test. I don't just automatically get that off. So literally this happened last night. So I'm at an event and somebody's texting me like, "Who do I contact? I can't go to my son cannot take this test and I need your help for whatever." So I'm trying to connect them to different things. But why should our kids have to choose between like celebrating Easter or Christmas and taking a test? Like, we don't have that natural respect, I would say, even though I worked really hard on the calendar, but they got the calendar wrong. And I was like, "Oh," so we had to go back. And that was something I was working on till late last night to try to fix that, because apparently it was through Fairfax County Public School System, which is one of the largest public school systems in the United States. All these kids were taking a test on their religious holiday. So now we had to go fix it. So it's things like that I would think you would take for granted, right? Like, I'm going to get Christmas off. I'm going to get Easter off. I don't have to worry about making up a test or whatever because I'm doing this. Our students can't do that. And they have to be put in a position where they have to advocate for themselves for the basic things that other students are taking for granted.
So frustrating. It's like so much of human conflicts really come to this like in-group, out-group thing,
even
right?
within our
Where
own culture and our own religion, so this is not just a it's an intra-religious and interreligious situation. So trust me, if we don't come from a place of commonality, there's a lot of conflict.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard for us. It's hard. I think it's just hard for humans. I mean, we have to be in this place, right? Like, I think we need to be in this place
Mhm.
where we're thinking globally, where we're
Yes.
having compassion for people suffering in all kinds of different
All world.
contexts all around
Yeah.
the world. But it's not, I think that's not in some ways very natural for humans, right?
No.
Like we evolved in hunter-gatherer tribes where you had
Yeah.
like max 150 people that you
And it
knew
was
your entire
literally in
life.
your, it was literally in this geographical area. It's only been in the last 15 to 20 years that this explosion of, being a more global world because of access to information that we have because of the internet. So
Yeah.
this next generation is a very unique generation because they don't know what it's like. So I feel like we're in the middle. We kind of knew the before and the after, right? And we can kind of figure that out. I'm just lumping you in with me. You're probably a lot younger. But our kids, like they're like, I saw a TikTok from some girl who's in like Australia. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
they have access to information that we don't have. So they need to be equipped to be able to live in a global world because their world is global. It's not just in the 2-mile radius of their house. So having that opportunity to learn and understand other cultures, I would say is a must now versus being like, oh, it would be nice to know. No, I feel like you now need to know what other cultures are doing because our world is actually smaller than it was even 15 years ago.
I agree. And I think there's a big backlash, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
like globally, there's a big backlash to like, let's get more insular, right?
Yeah.
As we need to expand.
Yes.
It's incredibly frustrating.
And it's fear-based, right? Like it's
Yeah.
because people are afraid of losing what they know, not recognizing what you're getting is so much better. So if we
Mm.
are not fear-based and if we're like, you know what, like I get to know somebody, like we're literally having this conversation and we're on different sides. We wouldn't have had this conversation even 5, 10 years ago. Like what a beautiful thing that is for expanding connectivity. Like I just feel like if you embrace it, it could be so great. It can be a wonderful tool.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. So what are, I would love for this episode to just kind of empower my listener a little bit and just the idea that we can say, and maybe if we're, if you're a dear listener, if you're a non-Muslim and you're in a conversation with some family and you've got that, that Uncle Joe who's got some bad
Yes.
ideas. What are some of the stereotypes that are out there, and can you help us debunk some of those? I mean, Zeba, I think that might be really helpful.
So
Give me
you
the
just
tools.
asked me. It's so funny because I we always joke like we actually had we went on a whole bunch of born again Christian podcasts, and a lot
Mm,
of people were like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" And we're like, "We're just gonna," and we're like, you know what? Throw whatever questions you have out of there because this is the truth of it. You're thinking it whether or not you're saying it,
mhm.
right? So I would much rather you say it and be able to understand, or even if you're not convinced, we're not trying to convince anybody, but if you can hesitate to
Mm.
think something when somebody mentions, or let's say you have that Uncle Joe at the table that's like, I met a Muslim person. Trust me, I have had my Uncle Joes. My mom's family is is Irish Catholic. They weren't necessarily, but they loved us, and they might not have loved other Muslims, but we were family, and they love us. So I feel like I'm in a unique position because I've actually seen that side from that perspective and understanding that it is a very fear-based. It's like my mom thought my dad was the cutest Mexican guy she'd ever met. And because she didn't know what Pakistan was, like her worldview really was in the south side of Chicago, right? Where she was like, the only dark skinned people I see other than African Americans at the time were Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants. There weren't that many Indians and Pakistanis in Chicago at that time. So you can't fault somebody for not knowing, right? So the one thing I would say is there are no questions for us, at least Uzma and myself, that are off limits. And we would much rather you ask us than think something or go to a site where it has fake news. You know, we all know those sites. I would much rather you talk to me and ask me. And if we don't know the answer, we can direct you to somebody who can answer those questions for you. So the biggest thing I would say is, one, ask, don't be afraid. We're just like you right now. I'm dealing with my poor cat who's at the vet right now and might have to have surgery. So I'm watching my phone very closely. In the meantime, I have my 4 kids like texting me at various times, like, is she okay? What's going on? We have the same fears, and we're literally going to throw money at the problem to make sure this baby lives, and we love her, and we're just like everybody. We're just like everybody else. And, when we say Allah, which is God, it's the same God that you pray to, or a Jewish person prays to, or a Christian person. And actually, if you study Buddhism and all that concept of a greater spiritual power, whatever you happen to call that person or that being, I want to say, we're praying to the same God. So I feel like that's the number one thing that people don't get.
Yeah, they think it's something separate and different.
It's something separate. Okay. And it's not. It's just the Arabic version for God.
Yeah. It's just a translation thing.
It's a translation thing.
Okay. That's cool. That's interesting. Well, I have a question. So
yes. I'm ready for it.
My daughter came out to me this year as a lesbian, and I understand that in some parts of Christianity and in Islam, it's considered a sin, bad, etc. It's not accepted at all. And I'm wondering, like, if that is the case, because I don't really know about Islam, what's happening for American Muslim parents when they have kids who are queer and are,
I'm glad you're answering your ads, because believe it or not, we at Mommy One Muslim get a lot of DMs from kids that are or fear, that's their words than mine, that they might be gay or lesbian. They would like us to talk about it so that their parents could get the answer. And honestly, that's what we did. We had a full series on the LGBT. We were the first American Muslim Muslim podcast period that had ever talked about it. We literally in one day lost 4,000 followers in one day from the hate. And we were just like, listen, whether you want to believe it or not, it's there. It's been there since the beginning of time. So you're in denial if you don't think that that's the case. That's one. Two, Uzma and I don't pretend to be scholars on anything, but what we are moms who want to have a support system for marginalized members, even within our own community. And that is the LGBTQ community. And we had a transgender woman come on there who, by the way, they're all, one was a lesbian, one was a transgendered, one was, she actually started a program for Muslim support, like it's a mosque. We wanted to be able to showcase, we're not saying this is right, this is wrong, that's not our job. Our job is not to judge you or to say this is what God, but our job is to provide you an outlet, a community within a community so that you can go get the answers. And that's what we did. And for every one listener that we lost, because how dare you talk, because I think a lot of people think if you talk about it, then all of a sudden your kid's going to be gay. Your kid is either gay or they're not. Okay. Let me just tell you that right now. So us talking about it is not going to convert them. Okay. It's just not going to happen. But what we can do is help some kid that's maybe, depressed, not knowing how to talk to their parents, not having a resource or support system. If we're able to provide that for them, that's what we're going to do. Did we get a lot of backlash within our community? 100%. We did. But for everyone, like I said, for every one person, there were 2 people that are like, thank God you guys are coming out. Sorry, pun. I did not mean to make that pun, but you're coming out with these resources for these kids because we're desperate. And who am I to sit there and say, if you're a transgendered woman, who by the way, still identifies as a Muslim transgendered woman, I'm going to support you. I'm going to hold your hand. I can't judge you. I don't know
Mhm.
what's going to happen to us when we die, but what I can do is here on this earth, if you need help, I'm going to help you. And that's what we try to do at Momming While Muslim. So we really do talk about these taboo topics that other people are like, who the heck are you to talk about it? We're like, people are talking about it anyway. We might as well, bring it out in the open and share with you guys the resources that we're uncovering while we're trying to research this for our listeners.
Wow, good for you. That's awesome. That's like a really brave choice, I think,
It
to
was
be
hard,
I bet that was hard to
but
just
we were begging people to come and people just did not. They weren't ready for it. They weren't ready. It took us 2 years to find
wow.
people open enough to be able to share their story. And I feel blessed that they shared their story with us because they felt safe to do so, because we've heard horror stories that somebody would say, I'm going to come and help you, but then turned it around on them. And we were like, no, we're not doing that. We truly
Oh,
want to help
wow.
you.
Mhm.
So it took us 2 years to find people brave enough to come on the show. And we're like, you don't understand how many people you're going to be helping. Because this is this and sex are the two things that people DM us about because they don't know. And that we get a lot of these emails and messages. And we really wanted to help these people because there were some kids that were like, I am so depressed, I'm contemplating suicide, and we were like, oh my god, we cannot help you, we want to help you. So this was kind of our version or our way of being able to help people on a broader scope. We individually helped everybody that emailed us. I'm sure you do the
Mm.
same, like if you're like, oh
Mhm.
my god, I have to do that. But in order to like put it on a bigger platform, it took us a couple of years because we really wanted to handle it gracefully, recognizing that we were going to lose people along the way, and we were okay with that.
Wow. Wow. That's good. That's good for you for doing that. I mean, I can imagine, that idea of having this open source of information for those, kids who are feeling unaccepted and that, maybe hating who they are because of,
Yes.
not because of anything that's their fault.
Mm-hmm.
It's heartbreaking to imagine that because obviously I can imagine that very
Yeah.
clearly for my own daughter.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but yeah, good for
And
you
getting in the
for
way of their spirituality, right? So
yeah.
they're saying, I still feel Muslim,
Mhm.
yet people are saying there's something wrong with me. Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, that's a really
Yeah.
hard thing because as a
Or
mom,
believing they're not accepted by God,
exactly.
right? Or
And they're
something
not
like that.
accepted by God, but they're like, but we still love God. So this is who I am. He made me this way.
Mhm.
Why would he not love me? Right.
Mhm.
So like there's a very fine line, and it's unfortunately not even easy for people to talk about in other religions and
Oh,
cultures.
yeah.
Like, so I just feel like it's a difficult thing for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, I haven't like drilled any Christians on the podcast about this, so I'm sorry if I'm like,
You're like, I'm not sure. But honestly, we love them. So like now we go to these podcast conference, they seek us out. They get excited. They're like, hi, how are you? And I'm like, you know what? Because again, we're we're breaking the stereotypes of what
Mhm.
they think. Like they're like, are we allowed? One guy, it's literally before we started recording, we're recording like this. Are we allowed to talk to you without your husband present? And we're just
Oh.
like, what are you talking about right now? He was trying to be respectful,
Mhm.
which not recognizing how filled with microaggressions that was. I don't need permission from my husband to talk to you. You see what I'm saying? Like, eh,
Mm.
and a
Mhm.
lot of times it's coming from ignorance, and we have to
Mhm.
take our own viewpoint about it and try to give the person the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes it's really hard to do. But I feel like if we can try, maybe it'll make our lives just a little bit easier, just a little bit easier.
I'm sure it's a little easier already from the work that you've done for many people. Um, what can non-Muslim parents and listeners, how can they make it easier, or how can we, offer support for people who are like dealing with the, challenges and aggressions that you may not even be aware of.
Well, recognizing, okay, so first of all, when you're watching the media or whatever the case may be, because of course that you're gonna always show you're not gonna show the everyday Muslims like myself taking out my garbage and going to a baseball game and doing that. Like we're boring, right? Like
Yeah.
that's not gonna make news. So, for every, and by the way, I even have these conversations with my own kids when things happen outside. So having those frank conversations with your kids being like, this is not always the case. Or if they bring something home or they talk about something, why don't we go and research it? Let's go. Like tonight, we're hosting an interfaith iftar, and I purposely invite some of the more conservative churches and stuff in the area. And sometimes people are like, why do you do that? And I'm like, because those are the people that we should be inviting. They don't have to come, but they have to see that we would love to invite you over and talk to you. And we're not trying to convert you or do any of those things, but really when you come, and that's why for our podcast, it's so great because we're talking from the perspective of a mother. It doesn't matter what religion you are, we want what's best for our children. And if you can come together on that, you really can bridge the gap. And that's kind of what we're trying to do on the podcast. That's what we're trying to do in general. So as a mom, just come as a mom, recognize I want the same thing for my children that you do. But by the way, not in replacement of yours, but he should have, or she should have just as much right to have a seat at the table. And if you're at a table and you look around and you're like, there's a whole lot of people that look like me, maybe going outside of your comfort zone and creating a space for somebody that might not look like you is probably the best thing that you can do, not only for yourself, for your children, and for future generations.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, it's like, if you're in the in group, it's everything's easier for us, but it's, I, at least as a white woman, I can say that, like, everything's easier, but we can specifically like seek out maybe different cultural events too, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Why not? Be like,
there's
hey,
like
listen, this would be kind of cool to learn about. Let's do this. Let's do this instead. Like, this is not something that's covered in our classroom. Like, maybe we don't have the funds for that, but maybe we can bring in a speaker that can talk about this from their perspective. And everybody, especially if you're coming from a place of privilege, you don't realize what power you have, you generically, to be like, hey, I want to bring somebody, not as a token. And that's the one thing I want to tell people, but because I genuinely think that what you have to say deserves to be said so that we can be better off knowing you have a place of privilege. And I would feel like an honor to do that.
an easy way for many people to start, especially with little kids, is like books and resources. Any recommendations there?
Oh, we have so many, like, we're so blessed right now. We're at this stage where Hannah Khan, Omar Khwaja, there's all these people that are writing for that younger generation. And of course, it's regular tween kid type books, but the main character happens to be Muslim.
Yeah.
And you kind of get a glimpse of, and so it's so great for my kids to see that, right? To see their representation on paper, but it's so amazing to be able to have these in mainstream libraries, because it's not that it's a book about Islam. It's just that the main character happens to be Muslim going on these amazing adventures that, guess what, you would too if you're reading another book. So we're in a really amazing period right now where we have these American born authors that are writing books for a non-Muslim audience, but still maintaining their identity. And I have to say, we're super blessed, and I'm happy to provide you links, connections to whatever authors I have connections to, because these people are doing amazing work.
That's great. Why don't we connect up with some of these links after the fact, and to listener, we'll put them in the show notes for this episode at mindfulmamamentor.com. I know some of my kids love like graphic novels and, all that stuff. It's a way to like normalize, create a mini culture in your home that normalizes ideas.
Yes.
Even if the larger culture is not accepting, we can create a mini culture in our home that is accepting. It's so cool.
Exactly.
Well, Zayba, there's so many things I wish I had time to talk to you about. You guys, Zayba has a training, a certification in spiritual mediation and conflict resolution from Sufi University and the Karama Institute. She is also trained in positive discipline, adolescent brain cognition from the Mindfulness Institute. I'm not even listing them all. I could talk to you about so many things because, as you know, those are all really fascinating
Yeah,
ideas
I love
for me.
each of them individually. I love them. But for me, because it is a very unique thing in our family, because for me specifically, it was breaking generational trauma. And that was the kind of the reason why I decided to kind of go that route, because within our own community, we don't have those resources. And it is a very unique subset, right? To be able to understand the cultural nuances. So I always joke, I didn't have there wasn't a PhD in parenting, but being a parent saved my life. So I decided to create one for myself. And in doing and helping myself, my hopes is to help other American Muslim moms kind of navigate this world, because it is, it's a very different world than what our parents grew up in, and how we grew up. And we kind of have to adjust to raise the best children possible, who still drive you nuts, by the way. So no one's talking about perfect kids, okay? We're talking about being the perfect, imperfect parent for your own children.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Zayba, I could talk to you so much. I love connecting with you. Where can people, so Zayba is the co-host of the Mommying Well Muslim podcast. You are obviously a podcast listener. Go check it out. That top 5 episode was fascinating to me. And where else can people find out about what you're doing and reach out?
Right now I'm the owner CEO of Emerge Consulting Solutions. And right now we're really focusing on the family sleep initiative, because if you know, good restful sleep really is the cure for a lot of things. And sleep issues is one of my major things, and coming from it from a spiritual perspective, and non-medication. Because unfortunately, a lot of things that in my research I'm finding are people are medicating themselves to sleep and not getting the restorative sleep that they need. So Merge Consulting Solutions, I believe we're on I'm not a social media person because that's my whole nother podcast. We'll talk about the effects of social media on the brain. But my social media team is on there. So look us up, and we're happy to help you.
Awesome. Zayba, thank you so much
Thank you, Hunter,
doing what you've done. And
thank you for doing what you do. And I love I love it.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's been really good to connect. And I can't wait to talk to you again more about all the 17 other things we could talk about.
Yes, absolutely. I'm here to help you however you want to be helped.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, Hunter.
Catch new episodes of the Mindful Mama podcast and other free resources, including the Mindful Mom Guide at mindfulmamamentor.com. You can listen to every back catalog episode, including interviews with Dr. Dan Siegel, Janla Van Zant, Sharon Salzberg, and get meditations, join our private Facebook group, and more. Go to mindfulmamamentor.com now. I'll see you there.